Tonight, Britain imposes drastic security measures as Blair condemns the terrorist barbarism. Good evening. America came under attack today from international terrorists on a scale that made it more an act of war. The centre of New York is still smouldering, with America's two tallest buildings in ruins. Terrorists also struck with remarkable ease at the heart of America's defence, the Pentagon. Also in Washington, other government buildings, symbols of American power, were emptied as the terror spread. Air traffic is paralysed, coast to coast, all key installations are on high alert. And amid the nightmare, the only estimate of fatalities is that they could run into many thousands. Out of the blue, at 8:45 this morning, New York time, a hijacked airliner carrying dozens of passengers flew straight into the World Trade Center's North Tower with devastating effect. 18 minutes later, a second attack. Another hijacked jet struck the Trade Center's twin South Tower, exploding in a huge fireball. Next, it was the turn of Washington and the Pentagon, the nerve center of America's military. A third hijacked American airliner, again with dozens of passengers on board, deliberately flown into the side of the building. As panic spread on the streets, all civilian flights were grounded, New York Stock Exchange was suspended, and the White House was evacuated, along with thousands of personnel in other government buildings. Then, the unthinkable. The South Tower of the World Trade Center, the world's fourth tallest building, collapsed, followed minutes later by the center's second tower. The building, symbol of global trade and workplace for 50,000 people, reduced to rubble. No one knows how many have died. A fourth hijacked plane crashed later in Pennsylvania. 45 people were on board. There were no survivors. There's been a stunned reaction across America and around the world. Here, Tony Blair has called an emergency cabinet committee meeting and put Britain on a high state of alert. Our first report on the day that terrorism struck at the heart of the world's most powerful nation is from James Robbins.
It should have been a perfect day, but just before 9 o'clock, the pure blue sky over Manhattan was filling with smoke. A hijacked American airliner had just smashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. No one quite knew what had happened. Surely this must have been a terrible accident. But what happened next showed these were no accidents. A second hijacked airliner, a Boeing 767 with 92 people on board, is flying straight for the other tower. By now, many hundreds of people must already have been dead, and the unfolding disaster could be seen all around New York.
Another one. I'm taking a look. Oh my God! Oh, dear! Oh my God!
My own eye. Just went in. Must be a car.
Oh my God! Another
plane just went in.
At that time, there would have been about 10,000 people in each tower of the World Trade Center, many thousands more in the Wall Street financial district all around. Those who could were running for their lives.
I was just standing here watching the World Trade Center after the first plane hit. I just saw a second plane come in from the south and hit the South Tower halfway between the bottom and the top of the tower. It's got to be a terrorist attack. I can't tell you anything more than that. I saw the plane hit the building.
When a big explosion happened, some guy came out, his skin was all off. I helped him out. This is him all over. There's people jumping out of windows. I've seen at least 14 people jumping out of windows. It's horrific. I can't believe this is happening.
We heard a big bang, and then we saw smoke coming out, and everybody started running out, and we saw the plane on the other side of the building, and there was smoke everywhere, and people are jumping out the windows. Over there, they're jumping out the windows, I guess because they're trying to save themselves. I don't know.
But it wasn't only New York and America's financial heart which was under attack. Now it was the nation's capital too. In Washington, the Pentagon was hit, headquarters for the armed forces of the world's superpower. A third hijacked airliner, again with dozens on board, had been crashed with devastating results. By now, smoke was billowing around Capitol Hill, and the White House was being evacuated. People were talking of a new Pearl Harbor, someone declaring war on the United States. And back in New York, the nightmare was still far from over. Firefighters were in the basement of the World Trade Center, wondering if the building above was safe. The unthinkable was about to happen. The South Tower, all 110 stories, collapsed, and it was all live on American television.
Thanks very much,
completely collapsed.
The whole side has collapsed?
The whole building has collapsed.
The whole building has collapsed?
The building has collapsed.
That's the southern tower you're talking about.
Exactly, the second building that we witnessed the airplane enter.
On the ground, emergency services hardly knew which way to turn. People still trapped in the second tower had seen it all and could only wave in desperation. But it was already too late for rescue. The second tower, representing America's trade and wealth, was about to go. The Twin Towers, which took 7 years to build, had been utterly destroyed in a single morning. The Manhattan skyline and countless lives devastated.
You're not going down on the ground. You will get trapped. You will get trapped. Don't go.
Big boom. Come down the steps. Everything fine till we got to the basement, and then everything just fell in. I got trapped under there with another guy. Crawled out. Kept getting hit in the head. Bags rolled around. Finally, we clawed our way out over the rubble.
Yeah.
Come on down. We did all right.
All right, way to be, Tom. Let's go.
Even the bloodied felt incredibly lucky on this terrible day. And firefighters could embrace each other for a few moments before facing many more hours of trauma. As New York struggled to cope, to adapt to the clogging dust, the fallout of so much tragedy, more news was coming in, a fourth crashed airliner in Pittsburgh. And somehow American government seemed almost powerless amidst all this. The centers of that power had been evacuated, key congressional leaders taken to secret locations. The president himself whisked to a nuclear bunker in Nebraska, shaken but pledging somehow to find those who masterminded this day of mayhem and massacre.
Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward. And freedom will be defended. I want to reassure the American people that the full resources of the federal government are working to assist local authorities to save lives and to help the victims of these attacks. Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts.
Hours after the attacks, the United States, the whole world, is struggling to take it all in. There's really no more rescue the firemen can seriously attempt. It's now a question of salvage amid the wreckage, as others in New York try to establish how many men, women and children have been lost. A priest picks his way through the New York ruins. The World Trade Center has been reduced to the stumps of skyscrapers that once helped define one of the world's most vibrant cities, normally loud with life. An entire society feels itself violated by terror. James Robbins, BBC News.
Our New York business correspondent, Stephen Evans, was in the World Trade Center when the planes hit the towers. Stephen was telling a local New York television station what he'd seen when, during the interview, one of the towers collapsed behind him.
We had that big explosion from much, much lower. I don't know what on earth caused that. The thing that strikes me is, one, the terribleness of the incident, whatever the cause, and we don't go into the politics, but whatever the cause, the terribleness, the hugeness of what's happened. So huge, in fact, that most of the people around simply can't understand what happened. People were just standing around, talking at each other, nodding their heads. Oh my God. We gotta go. We gotta go. We gotta go. Oh my God. We gotta go. Right, sorry, it's going down. It's going down. Don't worry, it's going down. It's going okay down. From here. But you need to shoot. Sorry, it's not like... Quick! Don't go into a building. There's no game. Right, come on. Get this. We're good here.
And Stephen Evans joins us now in New York. Stephen, first, there's news that another building has collapsed. Can you confirm it?
I can't confirm that anything has collapsed, but all I can confirm is that all the buildings in that complex, that vast complex that normally employs 50,000 people, must be tottering. I think we can bring you pictures of the scene as it is now, and you will see dust everywhere. What strikes me about the pictures is that a lot of the emergency vehicles have got dust and debris on top of them, and that's because they arrived there very, very quickly indeed, and then new buildings collapsed, new devastation was caused. I don't think anybody really knew how that structure, nor could anybody know how those structures would react to an aircraft, two aircraft flying into them. So the thing now is that nobody quite knows what's underneath that debris.
How long did it take people to realise how serious the situation was, that the buildings were doomed? When you were down there when you heard the first impact, how long did it take people to catch on that they had to get out?
It took people, people immediately knew they had to get out. People immediately knew that there was something serious going on, but actually you didn't know how serious. I didn't know how serious until, what are we now, 9 hours later. It is sinking in very, very slowly. One of the things, as I said, that happened was people got out and then simply stood at the base thinking, well, we've evacuated the building, therefore we're safe. And then literally hundreds of ambulances arrived on the scene, fire engines, whatever, and parked in that complex. One of the questions I think that will arise is how many people have died, if you like, in the aftermath of the accident. There is, if you like, a psychological aftermath to the accident as well. You might be able to see behind me Times Square, which is normally one of the busiest parts of this city. It is deserted now, partly because it's been closed off to traffic so that ambulances can get up and down this island, ferrying people wherever they need to be ferried. But also, people, I think, have gone home. It's a cliche in these events, if we've ever had an event like this one, that people are shocked and stunned. But they are. The few people who are down there are simply looking up at boards with the latest news and not saying very much indeed.
Stephen Evans, thank you. It may be at least 24 hours before there's any accurate estimate of how many have died in the attack, but the Mayor of New York said tonight the death toll would be more than any of us could bear. He also appealed for blood donations for the injured, who've been taken to 170 hospitals across New York.
Rescue workers overwhelmed by their task. For New York, this was a nightmare come true. The scale of the carnage remains unclear, but it's possible that many thousands of people may have been killed. It's still too dangerous for the authorities to search the rubble that was the World Trade Center. The National Guard has been sent in to relieve exhausted firemen. The hospitals are overwhelmed.
All right, well then let's go north then.
For a while, the city's mayor Giuliani was himself trapped in the emergency control center, which was close to the towers. Later, he said the city's hospitals had been coping with more than 2,000 injured, but it's clear there's much more bad news to come.
Good afternoon. The number of casualties will be more than any of us can bear ultimately. and I don't think we want to speculate on the number of casualties. The effort now has to be to save as many people as possible.
As survivors walked around dazed, no one could be sure how many did not escape before the towers collapsed. Some estimate as many as 20,000 could still have been inside. Across America tonight, families will be coming to terms with untold grief. Within a couple of hours of the attack, volunteers were queuing to give blood at this Red Cross centre after the city's hospitals reported a critical shortage. Red Cross shelters are also being set up, offering support to the injured and bereaved. In Washington, rescue workers tended to hundreds of defence staff. After the Boeing 757 had crashed into the Pentagon, there was an orderly evacuation from the rest of the building. But nearly 5 hours later, the flames were still too intense to allow rescue in some affected areas. Again, the death toll is uncertain.
I don't have any sense of scale at all. We know there are casualties. I can't give you a good number, and we're going to work to try to get that as quickly as I can, but we don't have it yet.
America is in shock. As well as the casualties on the ground, 266 died on board the 4 aircraft. But everyone knows that that is just the start. The full horror of what's been done to this resilient nation will take time to sink in. Neil Dixon, BBC News.
And I'm joined from Washington by our correspondent Tom Carver. Tom, what news from the seat of government tonight? Is the President back at the White House?
Not yet, no. He is flying back at the moment from an Air Force base in Nebraska, where within the last half hour he convened his National Security Council. He was on the phone. Dick Cheney was in the Situation Room underneath the White House with Condoleezza Rice, his National Security Advisor. A number of things came out of that. The National Guard in various places has been mobilized. The borders of America have been sealed, and forces around the world, American forces, are on the highest state of alert. Here in Washington, I should say that it really feels like the Capitol has been sealed off. Air Force One will be the only plane that will be allowed in here for the next 12 hours. Congress has been evacuated, so have all the federal buildings, and behind me here is the smoke from the Pentagon, which is still burning.
How is Congress and the Washington establishment reacting? What are they all saying the President should do? I gather he's going to broadcast later tonight. What has he got to say to satisfy them?
Well, the mood here, I would say, is a mixture of astonishment and anger. A number of congressmen are calling this a second Pearl Harbor and demanding immediate retaliation. I spoke within the last 20 minutes to an intelligence source, a senior member of the intelligence community, who said, we are at war at this particular moment in our history. Obviously, there are a lot of other people who are also calling for calm, but at the moment, that calm is not really being felt.
Tom Carver, thank you. Worldwide condemnation of the attacks has been swift, and so too have been the denials of guilt. Those responsible will have had money and resources that are available to only a few terrorist organizations, and the focus of the investigation into America's worst breach of security will inevitably fall on Islamic and extremist groups. As George Ekin reports, it will be those responsible for previous attacks on US interests around the world who will come under closest scrutiny.
To some, the horror and carnage inflicted on the United States today is a cause of celebration. This was the Arab quarter of Jerusalem, where many showed their approval of a day of unprecedented terror in America's backyard. A claim of responsibility was reported from one Palestinian group, but then swiftly denied. The Palestinian leader condemned the attacks.
We are completely shocked, completely shocked. Unbelievable.
Investigators hunting the organizers will first consider these were airborne suicide missions on a scale not seen since the Second World War.
I think it's almost impossible to believe that a hijacker could convince an American domestic airline pilot to commit suicide by flying into the World Trade Center. I have absolutely no doubt at all they had trained pilots. We know in the past that they've had pilots who have been perfectly capable of flying aircraft, and this can only be the only, I think, answer to this. American pilots would not do this, but Arab fundamentalists may well be prepared to.
And it's this wealthy Arab fundamentalist that American officials are already naming as an immediate suspect, Osama bin Laden. He controls and finances Al-Qaeda, an umbrella network of Islamic militants, and he's vowed to destroy the United States. Bin Laden is accused of masterminding a string of attacks, including the US embassy bombings in East Africa 3 years ago, which killed more than 200 people. In retaliation, the Americans fired cruise missiles at training camps used by bin Laden in Afghanistan. They put a $5 million price on his head and led a worldwide crackdown on Al-Qaeda. Afghanistan's ruling Taliban, which continues to offer bin Laden sanctuary, insists he isn't capable of carrying out attacks like today's. But bin Laden is suspected of involvement in the last attack on the World Trade Center 8 years ago. 6 people died when a bomb exploded in an underground car park. His associate, Ramzi Youssef, was jailed for that, and for plotting to blow up a dozen American airliners over the Pacific, a plan which in some respects foreshadowed today's terror. While the possibility isn't being excluded, no one's suggesting that the devastation of such high-profile international targets like the Pentagon and the World Trade Center is domestic terrorism. The sophistication of today's attacks, with highly trained perpetrators, and their synchronization to occur within 2 hours, point towards months, if not years, of preparation. Does all this mean, then, that a rogue state might be involved? Some experts are skeptical.
Countries have realized that as governments, their involvement in terrorism has cost them more than it's gained them. And so there are very few countries left who are in the real terrorism business. Obviously, some governments fund groups that may conduct terrorist acts, but that's very different than actually providing government support for it.
State condolences flood in, yet it seems highly unlikely, if not impossible, that the biggest and bloodiest terrorist operation ever could have been planned and prepared without a single government around the world even noticing. George Eakin, BBC News.
And we're joined now by our World Affairs editor, John Simpson, who's in Islamabad, and from Jerusalem by Orla Gearin. But John Simpson first. John, you've just been in Afghanistan, across the border, where you spent the last week. Bin Laden is supposed to be holed up there. Has he, in your view, got the resources and the organisation to carry out an attack of this complexity?
Yes, I think he has. He's got, we know, the fanaticism, he's got the followers, he's got the money, and he's got, frankly, the imagination to do it. He has something like 2,000 men in training camps in Afghanistan. Most of them, perhaps almost all of them, Arabs from countries like Algeria, Saudi Arabia, from Egypt. The best ones are selected off, the others simply go and fight in Afghanistan's own war, but the best ones are given special training. There's a camp, it's said, near Jalalabad, where people have heard gunfire in the mornings in particular, which may be one of those training camps. It's difficult to know. And he certainly does have the organization. After all, only 2 or 3 days ago now, 2 Arabs really using the cameras and so on, which were booby-trapped, managed to kill an extremely well-guarded figure of the Afghan opposition. They were traveling on Belgian passports, and I think the chances are that anybody who's operating in this part of the world will have easy access to passports, easy access to different forms of transportation right around the world, and they show their determination to do it.
John, if America wanted to go after bin Laden and his followers, they decided they were the target, how difficult would it be to hit at them?
Well, it's easy enough to hit at Afghanistan, and I do think it's important to draw the distinction between the Taliban government in Afghanistan, who are bin Laden's hosts, not perhaps all that willingly his hosts, and the man himself. I think it's frankly going to be extraordinarily difficult for the Americans to hit him. He's got his own peculiarly difficult and complex system of communications, which they simply can't break into. I think, frankly, if they're going to attack, they decide that the attack has come from there, they'll hit Afghanistan very hard, they'll hit the hosts, but frankly, I doubt very much whether they'll get the guest.
John Simpson in Islamabad, thank you. Ola Girin in Jerusalem, who do the Israelis think did it?
Well, for the moment, for Israel, Osama bin Laden is also the prime suspect, although what intelligence experts are talking about here is not bin Laden alone. They're not convinced that he has the infrastructure and the capability to pull off such a sophisticated attack that was coordinated so precisely. So what they're talking about is bin Laden plus. Bin Laden operating with the support of another state, speculation focusing on Iran perhaps or Iraq, although so far there is no proof of that. But certainly the presumption here is that this is Islamic extremists outside of Israel rather than on the inside.
How do you square Mr. Arafat's condemnation of this atrocity with the jubilation we've seen on Palestinian streets?
Well, to be fair to Yasser Arafat, I think he seemed to be genuinely as stunned and flabbergasted as the rest of us by these events. Yes, we did see some celebrations taking place and those scenes were quite horrific, but I think we have to put that in its context. We have not had mass spontaneous rejoicing across the West Bank and Gaza. In fact, most areas have been very quiet. I think the majority of Palestinians, like the majority of people everywhere, have been inside their houses, glued to their television sets, with increasing degrees of horror as they watch the events unfold. And I think that many Palestinians have been down on their hands and knees praying that this is nothing to do with them and that they won't be asked to pay any price for it.
Ola Girin in Jerusalem, thank you. Here, the Queen expressed her total shock at the terrorist outrages and sent her sympathy to President Bush. And the Prime Minister said Britain stood shoulder to shoulder with the United States in the fight against the terrorists. He announced that government and military buildings here had been placed on alert and that a series of measures were being imposed to step up aviation security across Britain's skies.
Here in Britain, a dramatic curtailing and rerouting of flights are among the measures agreed by the Prime Minister. Tony Blair spent more than an hour closeted with senior cabinet colleagues, officials and intelligence advisers.
We have stepped up security at airports to the highest levels. No flights will take off from the United Kingdom for which we cannot apply the highest standards of security for aircrew and passengers. Private flights have been stopped except where specifically authorized. Flight paths into London have been changed so there will be no civil overflights of central London. Security has been increased across the full range of government buildings and military premises.
But the bigger political question for Mr. Blair was how closely he wanted to associate Britain with the United States at a dangerous moment. There was no shred of doubt about that.
This mass terrorism is the new evil in our world. The people who perpetrate it have no regard whatever for the sanctity or value of human life. And we, the democracies of the world, must come together to defeat it and eradicate it. This is not a battle between the United States of America and terrorism, but between the free and democratic world and terrorism. We therefore here in Britain stand shoulder to shoulder with our American friends in this hour of tragedy. And we, like them, will not rest until this evil is driven from our world.
Earlier, domestic British politics was virtually put on hold as news of the attacks broke. Mr. Blair aborted a major set-piece speech on his policies at the TUC conference in Brighton, opting instead for a brief, shocked statement before rushing back to London. While the outgoing Tory leader, William Hague, announced a 24-hour delay in the counting of votes for his successor.
In the light of these events and in consultation with the candidates for the party leadership and the returning officer, I have decided to cancel the party meeting that was scheduled to take place tomorrow to greet the new party leader as a mark of respect for those who have lost their lives.
The new opposition leader, Ken Clarke or Ian Duncan Smith, will now be revealed on Thursday.
It's clear that these attacks mean more intrusive security in Britain and a closer interest in some of the dissident groups based here in London. But the bigger question tonight is just what Tony Blair means when he promises that the democracies will eradicate mass terrorism. The world's security system and Britain's place in that system are already changing shape tonight. Andrew Marr, BBC News, Westminster.
Today's attacks, which began with hijackings in Boston, will lead airlines around the world to review their security. Recent bombings in London mean that Britain is already on a heightened state of terrorist alert.
This evening, parts of the UK are on their highest security level for many years. Military activity at US bases here is visibly more intense. At British bases too, the security awareness level has been raised to amber, the second highest category there is. The raft of measures announced tonight will immediately affect our everyday lives, all because we're allies of America and are not immune to risk.
Since the end of the Cold War, the UK has very much shifted to wars that are conducted abroad, whether that's in West Africa, East Timor, or indeed in the Balkans. Wars of choice. What this indicates is that wars and conflict are not outside our own national territory, and that sometimes they come home and affect us, the individuals.
In response to events in America, the London Stock Exchange was evacuated, along with other prominent buildings. Elsewhere in the city, communications with the States failed. Workers could only watch in horror as events unfolded.
Yeah, you should be giving CR24 number to anyone who wants ongoing.
Control Risks advises businesses on how to minimise the risk of terrorist attack. Tonight, its message to increase security was taken up by thousands of private companies and by the government.
You're going to see all prestige buildings are going to be much more determined in their access control measures, in the movement of staff in and out of buildings. People who are travelling have got to expect they're going to meet a higher degree of checks than they've ever seen before.
All flights to the USA have been suspended indefinitely. More stringent checks have tonight been introduced at UK airports and security is being reviewed. It's already tougher than on domestic flights in America, where experts say airlines have resisted tighter, time-consuming precautions.
The domestic point has been known by anybody who knows anything as America's weakest point, and this has just proven it in the most horrific way possible.
In London, some police leave's been cancelled and hundreds of extra officers drafted in as the city's put on heightened alert. It's the same abroad. But even as Americans at embassies worldwide mourn the dead, the Foreign Office here warns there could be further atrocities and says British citizens travelling to Muslim countries should be particularly vigilant. Margaret Gilmore, BBC News.
The World Trade Center was among the world's most famous landmarks, a giant monument to the power of global business and the market economy. The complex was the size of a small city. Tens of thousands of people worked there. But its architects never imagined it would need to withstand the kind of attack seen today. Here's Fergus Walsh.
The Twin Towers of the World Trade Center dominated the skyline of Lower Manhattan. When the World Trade Center opened in 1973, they were briefly the tallest buildings in the world. They were also potent symbols of global commerce and world prosperity. Looking at these archive pictures, it's hard to believe they've been reduced to nothing more than rubble. They were quite simply enormous. Each tower was 1,350 feet tall, 110 stories high. The World Trade Center was the largest commercial complex in the world, effectively a mini-city. 50,000 people worked inside. 90,000 visited the building every day. 1,200 companies had offices there, including American Express, Salomon Brothers and Deutsche Bank. There were also scores of international trade organizations. Below ground was a huge shopping complex and even a subway station carrying thousands of people to and from the center. So how could this have happened within an hour of the impact, the towers collapsing to the ground? Unlike most conventional skyscrapers, the towers had no interior columns to give them strength. It was the exterior walls which bore most of the load, and so the direct attacks were enough to weaken them and make them topple. This image is like a scene from a Hollywood disaster movie, yet it was happening for real. Fergus Walsh, BBC News.
Within the last hour, the New York Stock Exchange has said it will be closed tomorrow. The effects of today's attacks are already being felt throughout world markets. I'm joined now by our business editor, Jeff Randall. Jeff, has a major financial centre ever taken a blow like this before?
You're gonna say,
At the heart of the American financial system. I mean, these towers were in the area known as Wall Street. This is America's financial system being hit hard, and it's really brought home the full horrors of terrorism.
Will they be in any hurry to reopen?
No, I don't think so. We've said that they won't be opening tomorrow. I'd be amazed if they open within a week, frankly. It's not just a question of fixing broken systems. It's about human spirit and decency. I spoke to some people in American banks here today who have friends on Wall Street. They weren't concerned about markets or share prices. They wanted to know what had happened.